The rain had been falling for so many days that she had stopped counting them by the calendar and started counting them instead by what they took from her. First the garden, drowned to a black soup along the fence line, then the split-rail bridge over the creek. Then, on the 14th night, the cabin itself, when the swollen water finally found the soft clay beneath its foundation and pulled the whole structure sideways into the current, like a tooth worked loose from a jaw. She had heard it going in the dark, a groan of timber and a long tearing sigh, and had stood barefoot in the mud with a lantern that would not stay lit, watching the roof she had slept under for 3 years slide downstream board by board until there was nothing left to watch. By morning the rain had thinned to a gray mist, and she walked the wreckage with her boots sucking at the mud, salvaging what the flood had not wanted. Her saddle, heavy with water but sound. A crate of hand tools, hammer, hatchet, awl, a coil of good rope, that she had thought to store on the high shelf out of habit rather than foresight. A few tins of beans. That was the whole of it, set out on a canvas tarp beside the ruined chimney like the belongings of a much poorer woman than she had believed herself to be the week before. Buck stood nearby with his ears turned toward her, patient in the way of a horse who had weathered worse nights than this one beside her, his chestnut hide dark and slicked with rain, and she pressed her forehead briefly against his warm neck because there was no one else to press it against. She was 22 years old and had spent every one of the last 6 summers riding cattle through this country, knew its draws and ridge lines the way other women knew the rooms of a house, and she was not, standing there in the mud, inclined toward self-pity, but she was inclined, strongly, toward arithmetic. The rented cabin was gone, and the rent along with any claim to shelter it had bought her. She had no money for lumber, and even if she had, the mills in Pine Ridge were backed up 3 weeks deep with orders from every other soul the creek had wronged that season. What she had was a horse, a saddle, a crate of tools, and whatever daylight remained before the mountains sent their first hard freeze down into the valley. She looked north, where the peaks were already wearing a thin collar of cloud that did not look entirely like rain anymore, and she made herself a promise, the way she might have made a bargain with a stubborn colt, plain, and without room to wriggle out of it later. She had until the first snow. After that, the open country would not care how capable she was, or how long she had ridden it, or how much she wanted to stay. She spent the first of those days riding the low country out of habit more than hope, following the fence lines she had mended for other men's cattle and the game trails she had memorized before she was old enough to be paid for knowing them. The mud had not yet given up its grip on the valley floor, and her gelding picked his way through it with the same careful patience he brought to everything, ears swiveling at the creak of saddle leather, at the far-off complaint of a magpie, at nothing at all. She counted the days without meaning to. 14, maybe 15, before the peaks finished dressing themselves in white and sent the cold down after her. She had wintered rough before, in line shacks not fit for the name, but she had never done it with nothing standing between her and the sky. It was on the 3rd of those days, following a spring branch she had crossed 100 times without curiosity, that she came upon the tree. She saw it before she understood the size of it, the way a person sees a mountain and only later reckons with how far off it truly stood. The cottonwood rose alone at the edge of a meadow, gone green even this late in a wet season, its trunk broader than the bed of a farm wagon, its bark furrowed deep enough to lose a hand in. The lower branches did not droop the way cottonwood so often did, heavy and complaining, but reached out level and thick, like the beams of a house someone had forgotten to finish building. She sat her horse beneath it for a long while, saying nothing, the way she might study a horse she meant to buy. watching how it stood, what it favored, what it might be asked to carry. At its base, the roots rose up out of the earth in great gray humps, and where two of the largest ones bowed apart, there was a hollow beneath, dry as a cellar, wide enough that her gelding could have stood inside it, out of the weather, with room left over for hay. She swung down and crouched at the mouth of it, running her palm along wood, smoothed by decades of wind, rather than any hand, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been drawn tight since the water first came into her cabin. She heard the spring before she found it, a low, steady murmur threading through the grass a few yards off, clear and cold where she cupped it in her hand, and she thought of the driest weeks of every August she had ever known in this country, and could not recall the ground here ever cracking for want of water. She stood a long moment beneath those level branches, counting not days now, but boards, rope, nails, the small, stubborn arithmetic of a life she had not yet let herself believe she could build. The abandoned cattle shed stood 4 miles east, a sagging skeleton of a building that some earlier hopeful had raised and then walked away from when the grass gave out beneath his cattle, and she rode there twice a day for the better part of a week, with a rope coiled at her saddle horn and her gelding patient beneath the growing weight of what she asked him to drag home. She counted the daylight now the way she had once counted coin, doling it out in her mind before the sun had cleared the ridge. 6 hours of usable light in late September, then 5, then something closer to 4.5, as the days drew their skirts in tight against the coming cold. The old-timers said, the first hard frost came to this country by the middle of October more years than not, and she had perhaps 3 weeks, perhaps less, before the ground hardened and her hands split, and the work that seemed merely difficult now became something closer to impossible. She pried boards loose with a flat bar, careful of the nails, for nails were dear, and she had brought only a small paper sack of new ones, bought on credit she could not yet cover. Each board she freed, she stacked and roped into a bundle behind her saddle, and Buck hauled them home at a walk while she led him on foot, her shoulder aching, her palms raw beneath her gloves. By the 4th trip, she had enough lumber laid out beneath the cottonwood to see the shape of what she meant to build, and she spent an evening with a stub of pencil and the back of a feed receipt sketching the platform that would sit in the crook of the 2 lowest branches, the narrow stair of notched wood that would climb the trunk, the small square that would be her floor and her roof both. The nights had already turned sharp enough that she woke twice to check the sky for stars, reading clear cold nights as a mercy and clouded ones as a warning, for a hard rain now, with no roof over her head but a wagon sheet lean-to, could undo in an hour what the flood had already taken weeks to ruin. She worked past dark by lantern light when her hands would still hold a hammer, and she rose before light to work again, and somewhere in that rhythm the ache in her arms stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like proof. Each raised plank a day gained against the frost, each length of rope another hour bought from a season that did not care whether she was ready. She did not let herself think past the platform yet, past the walls, past the little stove she would need before the first snow. There was only the counting, and the wood, and the tree holding still and patient above her, as if it had been waiting all this time for someone willing to build something worth keeping inside it. They came on the 4th day, 3 riders moving slow along the ridge trail, the way men rode when they had nowhere pressing to be and had heard something worth a detour, and she heard them before she saw them, the creak of saddle leather and a low laugh carried on the wind before the horses ever cleared the rise. She did not stop hammering. She had learned already, in the short, raw days since the flood, that stopping to explain herself cost more than it earned, so she kept the nail steady between 2 fingers and drove it home, while the men drew rein at the edge of the meadow and sat looking up at her, the way a person looks at a fair oddity, something to be remarked upon and then ridden away from. One of them was old enough to have worked cattle in the territory before it was much more than open range and Indian trails, his face folded like dry leather, his hat gone the color of the dust it had ridden through for 30 years. He was the one who spoke first, and his voice carried the particular amusement of a man who believed he had seen everything and was pleased to discover he had not. "Well now," he said, tipping his hat back to see her better, "didn't figure I'd live to see a woman roosting in a cottonwood like a fool hen." The two younger men laughed, easy and unkind, the kind of laughter that cost them nothing and was meant to cost her something. "You planning on laying eggs up there too?" One of them called, and the other made some remark about horses climbing ladders that she let pass by her like wind through the leaves overhead, because she had already decided, somewhere in the cold hours before dawn, that a person building a life out of nothing could not afford to spend any of it on men who had ridden a long way just to feel better about themselves. She drove another nail. She checked the level of the joist with her eye, and then with the little brass level she had salvaged from the ruined cabin, and she did not look down again until the plank sat true against its neighbor, and only then did she glance at them, unhurried, the hammer still loose in her hand. "Reckon I'll manage," she said. It was not much of an answer, and she knew it, but it was the only one she meant to give, and something in the plainness of it seemed to take the old hand by surprise, for his grin faltered a moment before he covered it with a cough and a shake of his head. He looked up at the platform, taking shape between the branches, at the ropes she had rigged through the crotch of the tree for hauling boards, at the neat, true lines of what she had already built, and whatever he saw there was enough to quiet him, though not enough to keep him from turning his horse and riding on with the others, their laughter trailing behind them thin and already half forgotten, while she picked up the next plank and set to measuring it against the last, because the frost was coming whether they laughed or not, and the tree did not care either way. 6 days remained before the frost the old-timers promised, and she counted them the way she counted coins, careful, unwilling to spend one more than she had to on anything that did not bring the roof closer to closed. She rose before light now, working by lantern glow until the sun came up thin and gray over the ridge, and she did not stop at noon the way she once had, eating cold biscuit with one hand while the other kept measuring, kept fitting, kept driving nails home with 3 sure strokes because a 4th was wasted effort and she had none to waste. By the 4th day the frame stood whole between the branches, its beams notched into the crotch of the cottonwood the way she had planned it that first evening, weight carried by living wood instead of posts sunk in ground that had already shown her what it thought of anything a person tried to root there. The porch came next, narrow as a plank walk but square and level, and she tested it herself before trusting it to hold anything more, standing at its edge with her boots braced and her hand on the trunk, feeling the whole structure answer her weight with nothing more than a low creak, patient, as if the tree had been waiting 100 years for someone to finally ask something of it. The pulley gave her more trouble than the porch had. She rigged it twice before it ran clean, a length of good rope threaded through an iron ring salvaged from the wagon, and when at last a bucket of nails rose smooth and steady from the ground to the platform without catching, she allowed herself a moment's stillness, watching it climb, before she went back to work because stillness was not something she could afford to keep. Below, in the hollow, where the roots bowed out wide enough to shelter a wagon team, she built the stable with the same care she had given the cabin above, laying a floor of packed earth and old planks, framing a feed box from shed lumber, hanging a hay rack where the roots curved just right to hold it steady. She fenced the corral last, dragging posts she had cut herself, and when Buck stood inside it that evening, ears forward, nosing at the fresh hay she had forked into the rack, something in her chest loosened for the first time in weeks. The rain came the following night, not the driving flood that had taken her cabin, but a cold, steady rain that soaked the meadow gray and turned her breath to fog, and she lay in the loft above the roots and listened to it drum against the roof boards she had cut and set and nailed with her own hands, dry, warm enough, alive with the smell of new-cut wood and wood smoke from the little stove, and she thought, before sleep took her, that she had built herself something the rain could not take. 12 days into the tree, and she had begun to count them the way she once counted cattle at the close of a season, a tally kept not from worry but from habit, though the habit had a worry buried somewhere inside it all the same, for winter would not wait on her pride, and the corral fence was still only half a fence, a scatter of posts leaning against the cottonwood's bark, like men resting after a long ride. She went out at first light to clear the brush along the fence line, dragging her hatchet through sumac and dead thistle gone brittle with the first frost, and the work was slow, the kind of slow that ate a morning without showing much for it, until the blade caught on something that was not root nor rock but wood, old wood, gray and split and driven deep into the ground at an angle no living tree would grow. She knelt and worked her fingers into the dirt around it and found a fence post, hand-hewn, its top rounded by some tool she did not recognize, and driven so many years past that grass had grown up through the cracks in it and made a kind of green stitching that held the wood together better than any nail could have. She followed the line it suggested, brushing aside brush and matted grass, and found another post 6 paces on, and a third beyond that, all of them leaning the same patient way, all of them pointing off toward the low ridge where she had never thought to walk. Buck had wandered loose from the corral while she worked, as he was permitted to do, now that trust between them ran both directions, and she heard him before she saw him, a steady scraping sound, hoof against earth, insistent in a way that was not the idle habit of a horse killing time. She straightened and found him some yards off, near the base of a hummock she had taken for nothing more than a swell in the meadow, pawing at the same spot again and again with a patience that unsettled her more than it should have, for Buck was not a horse given to fuss without reason. She crossed to him and laid a hand on his neck, and he quieted under her palm but did not move his feet, and when she looked down she saw what his hoof had already half uncovered, a marker, iron-capped and weathered near to illegible, driven into the ground with the deliberate care of a man who had meant it to be found again some day, though not, she suspected, by a stranger with a cottonwood full of borrowed lumber and a horse who would not leave the spot alone. She crouched and set her fingers against the cold iron, and the meadow around her, which she had thought she understood down to its last blade of grass, seemed suddenly to hold a great deal more than she had ever guessed. 6 days remained before the man with the papers had promised to return, and she counted them now the way she counted rain clouds in a dry season, with a wariness that had become its own kind of labor. She fetched the hand shovel from beneath the wagon bed steps and returned to the marker, and Buck stood over her the whole while like a hired watchman, his ears pitched forward, his great dark eye following the blade as it bit into ground that had not been turned in longer than she cared to guess. The earth came away in heavy, root-laced clumps, black and cool beneath the sun-baked crust, and she worked with the steady patience her father had taught her for digging post holes, not hurrying, not resting, letting the shovel do what her arms alone could not. It was the ring of iron against iron that stopped her, a small, flat sound, swallowed almost at once by the wind moving through the cottonwood's leaves overhead, and she knelt and cleared the last of the dirt away with her bare fingers, the way a person might clear soil from something they suspected was fragile, or holy, or both. What she uncovered was a box no larger than a bread tin, its lid rusted at the seams, its corners softened by years of damp and drought passing over it in turn. She lifted it free and felt its weight shift inside, papers sliding against metal, and she sat back on her heels in the grass with the thing cradled against her knees for a long moment before she trusted herself to open it. The hinge gave with a groan. Inside lay a folded bundle of papers gone the color of weak tea, and beneath them, pressed flat, a hand-drawn map inked in a careful, deliberate script, its lines faded but legible, showing the meadow, the spring, the swell of the ridge, and beyond it, pastures she had never troubled to walk because she had believed them to be nothing but wasted ground. The topmost papers were grazing tallies, columns of numbers and dates recording horses by the dozen, feed measured in wagon loads, months and years marching down the page in a hand grown less steady toward the bottom, as though the man who kept them had aged while keeping them. She read the dates twice to be certain her eyes were not deceiving her, for they reached back further than she had lived, further than most fences in the valley had stood, and she understood then, with the particular chill of a truth arriving all at once, that the cottonwood and its spring and this quiet meadow had not simply been forgotten ground waiting for someone careless enough to claim it. It had been a ranch once, tended and counted and cared for by a man whose name did not appear anywhere on the page, and something in her chest tightened at the thought of him, whoever he had been, and at the question of where he had gone, and why the land had been left to wait so long for someone to come looking. She set the tallies aside and unfolded the map beneath them, the paper soft as cloth from handling, and traced with one finger the faint lines drawn in a hand both careful and hurried, as though the man had wanted the truth of the place set down before something took it from him. The lines did not follow the fence posts she had found. They ran instead from the spring itself, curving beneath the roots of the cottonwood and down through the meadow toward two low pastures she had taken for nothing but scrub and stone. She had 6 days by her own reckoning before whatever patience Kellen possessed ran thin enough to matter, and she spent the better part of one of them on her knees in the wet grass at the base of the tree, working her fingers into the soil where the map told her to look, until she struck wood that was not root at all but hewn timber, gray and swollen with age, laid in a trough someone had dug and covered with care a lifetime before. She pried a section loose with the flat of a shovel and found the channel running true beneath it, narrow and lined with flat stones set close, carrying a thin, steady thread of water away from the spring's overflow toward the lower ground. It had silted near shut in places, choked with roots and years of leaf fall, but where the water still moved, it moved with purpose, and she understood all at once why the grass in the 2 far pastures grew greener than the rest of the valley without a soul tending it. The old rancher had not merely lived beside the spring, he had bent it to his will and sent it walking through his land like a hired hand who never asked for wages. She worked the channel for 3 days running, her hands split and her back aching in a way that made her grateful for the ache, clearing silt with a trowel and her bare fingers, resetting stones that had shifted, until the water ran clean and quick all the way to the second pasture and stood in the old stone trough she had found half buried near its edge. Buck watched her from the shade, with the mild interest of a creature who had long since stopped questioning her judgment, and when she finally straightened and looked upon what she had made, she felt something close to the pride a person feels upon finishing a fence, or a roof, or any other honest thing built with the hands God gave them. Word of running water in a meadow long thought dry traveled faster than she expected through a country starved for it, and within the week 2 neighboring ranchers rode up the track to ask, plain and hopeful, whether she might take on a horse or 2 for pasture and a fair price. And she said yes, before she had rightly finished counting what feed she had to spare. By the 10th day of that new arrangement, she had 4 horses in the lower pasture and a small tin box under her cot, with more coin in it than she had held at one time since the flood took her cabin, and she had begun to believe, foolishly perhaps, that the worst of her troubles lay behind her rather than ahead. That was the day a rider came up the track at an unhurried pace that somehow still managed to feel like a threat, a heavy-set man, near 45 years in age, gray already salted through his beard, sitting his horse with the settled weight of someone accustomed to being deferred to. He did not dismount at once. He sat looking up at the platform among the branches, at the little porch and the pulley rope, and the smoke curling thin from the stovepipe, with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite contempt, but some cousin of both. "Didn't believe the talk when I heard it," he said. "Woman living in a tree." She came down the ladder rather than answer him from above, because she had learned already that a person looking down at another person rarely spoke to them as an equal, and she wanted, whatever this was, to meet it standing on her own ground. "It's a fair home," she said. "What can I do for you?" He introduced himself as Amos Kellen, of the Kellen Ranch bordering the meadow to the east, and he said it the way a man says a thing he expects to carry weight on its own. Then he drew a folded paper from inside his coat and held it out, not quite offering it, more displaying it, the way one shows a hand of cards already understood to be winning. "This meadow's Kellen land," he said, "has been surveyed as part of my range since before you were walking. That marker you found don't signify nothing. Markers get moved, get forgot, get wrong. I'm a reasonable man. I'll pay you something for your trouble and your lumber, and you can take that fine little cabin apart plank by plank if you've a mind to, and be gone from here inside 10 days. After that I file my claim with the county clerk in Pine Ridge, and it won't matter what you say or what you found buried in the dirt." The spring went on running behind him, indifferent, toward the trough and the pasture, and the horses grazing there on grass that had not grown so green in years, and Sadie stood with her split and aching hands loose at her sides, and felt the whole fragile thing she had built rise up cold and precarious under her ribs. 10 days, she said, is a peculiar amount of time for a man so certain of his own paper. Kellen's mouth tightened at that, and he touched his hat with a courtesy that carried no warmth in it at all, and rode back the way he had come without another word, leaving the meadow to close in behind him like water over a dropped stone. Sadie watched him go until the dust of him settled into the grass, and then she did not weep, because weeping had never yet mended a fence or fed a horse, but she went up into the tree with her hands still trembling and pulled the iron box out from beneath the loft floorboards where she had hidden it, and began again, more carefully this time, to go through everything it held. 10 days. She turned the number over in her mind, the way a person turns over a stone looking for what might be crawling underneath it, and set the grazing records aside, brittle and foxed with age, and unfolded the first map again, and beneath it, tucked so close to the box's seam that her fingers had missed it twice before, she found a second paper, thinner, the ink gone the color of weak tea, and across the top of it, in a careful surveyor's hand, were written 2 words that made her sit back hard against the trunk: Cottonwood Rest. It was a name, not a boundary, and beneath it lay a description of the property, the spring, the meadow, the two lower pastures, the very hollow of roots she now called a stable, set down decades past as a stopping place for riders and stock moving through the valley, a way station established by men whose names meant nothing to her, but whose lines and measurements matched the ground beneath her feet with an accuracy that made her chest ache with something close to vindication. Here was the tree, here was the water channel, sketched thin and faint beneath the roots, exactly where she had found it running. Here, plainly, was proof that the meadow had once stood apart from Kellen's range entire, its own small kingdom with its own name and its own purpose. But a name was not a deed, and she searched the box twice more, laying every scrap out on the loft floor in the fading light. The grazing ledgers, the map, a rusted awl, a button gone green with age, and there was no paper anywhere among them that spoke of ownership transferred, of a sale recorded, of anything a county clerk would set beside Kellen's confident stack and call equal. The deed itself, the one document that might have silenced him where he stood, was simply not there, and outside the window the light was going gray over the pasture, and somewhere below in the dark of the roots she heard Buck shift his weight and stamp once, as though even the horse understood that time, now, was the only enemy left worth reckoning with. She did not sleep, though she lay in the loft with the map spread across her knees and the little stove ticking as it cooled, counting the hours the way a person counts coins they know will not be enough. Kellen's deadline stood at noon, and the clerk's office in Pine Ridge was a 2-hour ride on a good road, longer if the low crossing had not yet drained from the last rain, and somewhere in that arithmetic there was no room left for searching further, and yet she could not make herself stop believing that the tree had one more thing to give her, the way it had given her shelter and water and shade when she had nothing else to ask of the world. It was Buck who told her where to look. She heard him before dawn, the dull scrape of a hoof against packed earth repeated with a patience that was not restlessness but something nearer insistence. And when she came down the ladder in the gray half-light, he was standing at the western root, pawing the same spot again and again as though he meant to dig clear through to the spring itself. She had walked past that root 100 times, had leaned her shoulder against it while mixing feed, had never once thought to wonder why the ground there sat lower than the ground around it, packed hard and strange beneath a skin of old leaves. She knelt and began clearing it with her hands, and then with the flat of a spade, and the earth came away in dry curls to show a lid of fitted stone no bigger than a bread box, set into a wall of smaller stones, laid with a care that spoke of a man who had built to last, who had built to be found. Her fingers were shaking when she lifted it free. Inside, wrapped in oilskin gone stiff and dark with age, lay a folded deed, its ink faded but legible, naming the parcel Cottonwood Rest, and setting its bounds by the spring and the great tree itself, and beneath it a single sheet in a careful, deliberate hand, stating plainly that the property was never sold, that it would pass in ownership to whoever restored the spring's flow, rebuilt its fencing, and raised again a shelter for stock beneath its branches. She read it twice, standing in the cold, with the sun not yet over the ridge, and then she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that startled a jay out of the branches above her, because she understood all at once that she had done every one of those 3 things already, without knowing she was answering a question someone had asked 80 years before she was born. Buck nudged her shoulder as if to hurry her along, and somewhere behind her the horizon had begun to pale toward the hour when a claim, once made, could no longer be unmade. She did not wait for the sun to finish its climb before she was in the saddle. The deed and letter pressed flat inside her shirt against her heart, as though she feared the wind itself might snatch them back into the ground that had kept them so long. Buck seemed to understand the weight of the hour. for he took the miles to Pine Ridge at a pace she had never asked of him before, and never needed to, his breath coming in great white plumes against the cold morning air, his hooves striking the frozen road like the ticking of some vast and patient clock finally come round to its final minute. The county clerk had not yet unlocked his door when she reached the office, and she stood on the step with her hand pressed flat against the wood, counting the seconds as if she might will them to slow, until at last the bolt turned and a startled, sleep-creased face looked out at a young woman, wind-burned and trembling, holding out a folded paper as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. He read it by lamplight, slowly, his spectacles catching the glow, and when he looked up, his expression had already answered her, before his voice did. "This predates Kellen's filing by better than 60 years, he said. "There's nothing for him to claim, and that was all, though it took the better part of the morning to make it official, ink drying on ledgers while she sat with her hands folded and her heart finally, blessedly still. Kellen came out to the meadow himself once the papers were settled, riding slow and saying little, and when he saw the corral mended and the horses fat, and the water running bright through the old channel exactly as it had been built to run, something in his face eased that had been tight since the day he first rode up with his own claim in hand. He did not apologize in words, but he left that afternoon with 2 horses boarded for the winter and returned the following spring with 3 more, and in time it was Kellen's own hands who helped her raise a second stable when the first grew too small for all the stock the valley wanted to send her. By autumn, the meadow wore a different look than it had worn in 100 years, fences taut, trough full, the great cottonwood standing over it all with her small cabin nested in its arms, and Buck sheltered warm beneath its roots, and travelers passing through began to speak of Cottonwood Rest not as a curiosity but as a place a horse and rider could count on, built by a woman who had lost a roof and found, instead, a home no one had ever thought to build before.